Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
At last, we meet for the first time for the last time.
All right, so I am going to begin. Brian, I guess we'll toss it back and forth, if you will. I'll share one of mine. You share one of yours. I know I have a few more than you do, so of course you can comment on mine. As I said earlier, I picked the debates for various reasons. So what I'm going to do is just say the name of the debate, the topic, and then I'm just going to discuss it briefly and why I picked it. So the first debate I picked, and they are not in, it's not my number one favorite debate. It's just happened to be the first one I thought of, but it is my favorite debate on the resurrection. And this is between James Crossley and William Lane Craig. It was in 2012, and it was entitled, "Was Jesus Raised from the Dead?" Now, one of the things I love about this debate is, first of all, James Crossley is just very likable. He is a distinguished scholar on the topic. He also holds that Mark was written early. I think he dates it around 40 AD, which is pretty great. But he holds to the hallucination hypothesis, that the best explanation of the postmortem appearances of Jesus was hallucinations. Now, what I find most memorable about this debate was, of course, the cordial discussion, how knowledgeable both men were. And one of the things that was interesting in a clash of styles is Crossley at the time is this young, cool-looking professor. And then you've got Craig, who is your older statesman, dressed up very sharp as he always is. And so that was an interesting, just stylistic observation. But I remember in the debate, Craig using the fact of the postmortem appearances to make a really good case for the resurrection on its just with that fact. And I was really impressed with that because typically you hear more of a minimal facts or something like that where, hey, we're going to look at these, some people use 4, 5, 6 facts, and we're going to talk about what the best explanation is. Craig started that way, kind of this minimalist case that he makes. But then when they really got into the discussion on the postmortem appearances, I thought Craig did a really good job of using that one fact almost to be pretty persuasive. And so those are some of the reasons why I just love that discussion. And I've gone back and watched that debate I don't know how many times.
It was funny about these debates is that you remember them way better than me.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, like it's not as vivid in my mind. I suppose if I went back and watched, you know what? Maybe because when you watch a debate, do you watch it? Or do you listen to it?
I do both. Sometimes
okay.
I watch and sometimes I listen. Yeah, sometimes I'm watching and listening, and then other times I'm walking around the house and doing stuff and listening. It depends on how into the debate I am, and also whether or not I've heard it before.
Right.
Okay, what about you? What do you got? What did you got?
Okay, well, I'm only got 3. I thought I'm going to yammer too much about this 7 things, and it's more like you've got a lot I know you were going to mention. So I'm just going to pull out what I think are just classics.
All right.
And I see that there's one that's on your list. So I'm going to say William Lane Craig versus Peter Adkins.
Oh.
As one of the absolute classics. Peter Adkins being this older gentleman who's
so cranky.
I suppose I have another word that comes to mind, crotchety. He's
there you go.
A crotchety, grumpy guy, and he comes across that way. In certain different contexts, he seems like he'd be really a cuddly teddy bear, but in this one, he was just kind of crotchety, and just science is his whole thing. Like, science can do anything, and there was this, this quote I'm referring to. Maybe we'll link it to the show notes, but I just send people to watch William Lane Craig versus Peter Atkins. And most likely, if you search in YouTube, you will find the excerpt of the thing I'm talking about where he's like, well, what's one thing that science can't do? And William Lane Craig, it must have had like flashcards that he'd studied for a year. And he's like, well, I can think of 5 or 6 different things that science can't explain. It can't explain the moral facts that we observe in our, and he just goes on as
and he
like
talks
Peter,
about like aesthetic beauty, mathematics, and then ends. And then
science itself can't be just.
and then William Buckley, who's the moderator, says, "Put that in your pipe and smoke it."
But the whole time, the camera sort of like, the cameraman must have been like, "Get a load of Adkins," because he switches over, and as you see, each time the camera cuts to Peter Atkins and then it goes to a wide shot, it's almost like he's shrinking down into his seat in slow motion. Like he's just staring blankly. Please God, let this end.
Yes.
But at the same time, it was like the biggest slam dunk while William Lane Craig is just saying it in such a humble, sympathetic way.
Yes.
Well, actually, there are a lot of things that science can't explain. And it was just, man. So that's a classic. And
I agree.
Entertaining. But again, great defenders of each side. Great debate.
Yeah. So my second one is Jeffrey J. Lowder versus Frank Turek. And the topic there was what better explains reality, naturalism or theism? And that was in 2016. One of the things I appreciated about this debate, well, a number of things I appreciated, I suppose I should say, is first of all, I love Lowder's case that he presents here for naturalism, which I know sounds strange coming from a Christian, but it's very reminiscent. And I wrote this in my debate review I did of this one. It's very reminiscent of Craig. He starts out with a couple contentions. He has arguments to support those contentions, and he sticks to those. And so I thought this was a great clash between Turek, who's very good at storytelling, comedy, keeping the audience engaged, where Lowder, I thought, really majored on that logos, those logical arguments. And so it's a really good clash between the two. And I actually wrote in my review that I thought they could learn from one another. I thought that Turek could learn from Lowder to present his arguments in a little bit more formal manner. And I thought that Lowder could learn from Turek in including some more rhetoric in a way that is persuasive and helpful, meaning the storytelling and the comedy and things like that. And so that's just, I think, a high quality debate. And it's also very cordial. I mean, even the cross exams are just fun to watch, and you can tell that they're both having a good time.
Mm-hmm. Here's a shared debate that's on your list, and that's Christopher Hitchens versus William Lane Craig. I promise my third one isn't a William Lane Craig one, but he's just done so many debates that for him not to have be on the list would be like ignoring so many things. At any rate, so Christopher Hitchens, at the time it was like at the apex of his tour of atheism and stuff.
Oh, and the new atheism was all the rage. Yeah,
it was like right in that hot point, that Justin Brierley would have been talking about. But anyway, Christopher Hitchens and William Lane Craig. This is like the debate of the decade kind of event.
Indeed.
And like a packed out audience. And again, best defenders of the positions. And in this sense, maybe Christopher Hitchens was most vocal, most well-known, most popular defender, most entertaining and caustic. And he was that sort of defender of his position. I think other people can make better cases logically, but as far as persuading people, he can be very persuasive. But that was a great debate to recommend, I think, for people who are wanting to see a contrast between actually making arguments and making complaints or criticisms. It's like Hitchens didn't have a case for his position. He had complaints. He doesn't like Christianity, or he doesn't like God. And was there a point in that debate where he's like, Craig says something like, I'm yet to hear an argument or something like that?
Yes, he did indeed. And Craig was also very good at pointing out, as he always is, that none of his arguments were really addressed or torn down, if you will. Yeah, I picked that one, but for a couple of reasons. First of all, not because it's the most high quality debate.
Yeah,
and I'll talk about that in a moment.
Yeah.
But the lead up to it was almost like a prize fight. And I really, and it was so memorable. So that was a lot of fun. I also think that this debate is a great example of someone who's really strong on that logos. Remember, that's building up those logical arguments in Craig, and then someone like Hitchens, who almost entirely relied on pathos, these appeals to emotion. And, for example, he always tells these stories to illustrate the problem of evil. And this debate is also really memorable to me because I remember that John Mark Reynolds wrote a book with Phil Johnson, who's since passed away. And he talks about how he was talking to his own kids. John Mark Reynolds does. He was talking to his own kids after this debate between the Hitch, as they called him, and Craig. And they had this rich discussion about how Craig clearly decimated Hitchens when it came to logical argument, but how many people walked out of there thinking Hitchens won because of his swagger. Mm-hmm. And I'm paraphrasing, of course, the discussion that he has in the book.
Sure.
And so it to me, this one really illustrates how you've got to be able to read through the rhetoric and the appeals to emotion and think, okay, but who's actually making arguments? And I think you put it well, versus complaints.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll freely say, too, I absolutely loved listening to Christopher Hitchens. I thought he was a great storyteller. He made me laugh. He was one of the only four, you remember the four horsemen of the new atheism, Dennett and Dawkins and Harris, and then Hitchens. Hitchens was the only one that I actually thought came across as very charming, very likable. He could be saying things that I sometimes even would say I found offensive, but then 5 minutes later make me laugh. And he was one of those guys that I felt like I would love to sit down and have a coffee with and just have a discussion. Of course, he would want to have a different kind of drink, but that's neither here nor there.
All right, hit me with another one, Chad.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, it's my turn because you started that. So my next one, and again, these are in no certain order, was a 2019 debate between Braxton Hunter of Trinity Radio and, of course, very popular skeptical YouTuber and skeptic Matt Dillahunty. And I thought this debate really exposed some problems in Dillahunty's epistemology. I also thought that Hunter did a great job of unapologetically presenting the Kalam cosmological argument, and he even makes a quip in the debate, something to the effect of, the Kalam is not dead, contrary to what you have heard. And Braxton also does a great job using an argument from free will that, again, I think exposes some problems for Dillahunty's moral positions. And so, to me, I've watched a lot of Matt Dillahunty debates. And sometimes I find him interesting. Other times I find him evasive. And other times I find him extremely frustrating. I thought Braxton did the best job of anybody I've ever seen handling Dillahunty and also holding Dillahunty's feet to the fire. And I thought that showed in Dillahunty's performance because he wasn't as cantankerous as he can be sometimes. And so those are some of the reasons I really, really enjoy that debate.
I'll have to go back and listen to that one because it's been so long. I don't even remember.
Oh, but, sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, so I pulled another one out that I thought, all right, was it a great debate? No, never, not necessarily, but it was memorable, very memorable and interesting.
Yes. I picked some of mine because they're memorable, so yeah, I get it.
Norm Geisler versus Paul Kurtz on the John Ankerberg show.
Oh, yes. Wow, that's an oldie.
It is very old.
You're going way back.
But, it was almost like Norm Geisler in his prime, in the sense of, how Norm Geisler had this sort of way where everything's like a pat answer almost?
Yes.
It's almost like, here's my objection. Boom, here's my rhyming answer. You know
yes.
what I mean?
No, there are actually sometimes where I'll go back and listen to Geisler and I'll hear something and I can finish what he's going to say.
Yeah, well, this was just like, he was just so fast to the draw with
formidable
with answers. Now, if I was a unbeliever, I might think, oh, these are all just memorized answers. But at the same time, I'd think like, okay, but they're not bad answers. It was very impressive in the sense of his quickness, in the sense of like what a broad variety of things were. It almost came across like, no, thought about that one. That's been answered. Here's 3-4 reasons why. Next. Next. It was almost like, he's just there's a conveyor belt of objections coming at him, and he's just chopping them up with like Ginsu knives. It was just really interesting. And I remember just hearing like John Ankerberg's voice in my head. All right, well, we're back here with this debate between Norm Geisler and Paul Kurt, and you hear his voice, and it's like so 80s or something. I don't know when it was, but it's just got that vibe to it. But classic debate. They were debating secular humanism, Christianity or secular humanism. And it was really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know what I'll say about Norm Geisler? I think I've told you this story before, but when I probably, a year after I got married, I went to a conference just to attend. And he was speaking, and I met him. And he handed me his card, and he said, hey, if you're interested in coming down to Southern Evangelical and checking it out, I'd be happy to host you. And it was one of those things where I thought, yeah, right. I'm sure you're going to, host me, Norm Geisler, like, all these people that want to have contact with him or whatnot. So I reached out, and sure enough, he invited me down. Danielle and I went down. We met him at the seminary. He took us to lunch, and we spent like 2 days at his house with him and his wife, and he had other people over. He was the most gracious host. And of course, I was trying not to just bombard him with every apologetic question that I could think of, but I did end up doing that a good bit. And he was just such a gracious guy and signed books for us. And it was a really good experience. He was genuinely somebody who lived out what he believed. Yeah.
Great stuff.
Yeah. So my next one, and I do want to give a kind of a correction for Christians on this, but let me lay it out here, is a 2019 debate between Arn Ra and Michael Jones. And the topic was, is Christianity dangerous? Now, before I tell you why I picked this one, I want to say that it's not Aaron Ra. It's Arn Ra. And Arn is actually somewhat sensitive to that. But people still get up to the microphone almost every time and say, this question's for Aaron. And he's very quick to say Arn. So if you're going to address him, get his name right, is all I'm saying. So I loved this debate because Michael Jones absolutely decimated Arn Ra on the definition of faith. And Arn Ra has been going around peddling this false definition of faith for I don't know how long, that faith is a blind leap in the dark. Faith is claiming you know what you have no evidence for. And Jones showed that historically the word has never been used that way, that it's not a proper exegesis of the text. And it was, I will just say, a delight to watch because, to be honest with you, one of the things I meet with an atheist friend of mine once a month for coffee. And one of the things I try to do is take his position and make a steel man so that I am not tearing down a straw man or a false version of his argument. And it was so gratifying to see this straw man that has been propped up for what I would say years, just completely obliterated. And so that is why I like that debate so much. I also really like the debate a lot because Arn Ra, if listeners are not familiar, is he prides himself on relying on science. He's all about the science. If you go back and watch this debate and you ask yourself the question as you're watching, who's relying on the science and who's relying on personal stories and anecdotes, you are going to find that it was Michael Jones who was presenting the science and the studies. And it was Ra who was presenting personal anecdotes, stories, and opinions. And so those are some of the reasons why I love this debate. And I am just being completely transparent when I say I found it very satisfying to see such a false view blown out of the water so beautifully. And Michael Jones, if by any chance you're listening, as I told you when we interviewed you, thank you for that.
And thank you, Aaron. And Aaron, if you're listening. All right.
Wow.
All right. Give me the next one.
Okay. So my next debate, by the way, I have three more. My next debate is, and again, Brian, it's like Brian said, William Lane Craig has debated so many times. so many of the top thinkers that if you're thinking, gosh, these guys are like Craigites or something. No, not really. It's just he's debated a lot of the best people out there. This debate was in 2013, and it was called Is Intelligent Design Viable? And why I loved this debate between William Lane Craig and Francisco Ayala was because two reasons. First of all, Ayala, speaking of that ethos piece, remember that's the authority of the speaker or their status, right? This was an award-winning evolutionary scientist. So we're talking one of the top 2 or 3 scientists in the United States that Craig is debating. And of course, the topic being, is intelligent design viable? Or another way to put it is, they debated how does intelligent design fit into science, or does it fit in at all? The other thing I loved about this debate, Brian, is the framing of the debate. Craig laid out some reasons why he thought intelligent design should be considered as a scientific endeavor, but then he took the role of a skeptic, and he laid out the differences between microevolution and macroevolution. He talked about some of the reasons that he believed macroevolution, that he was skeptical of it, but then he said, but I'm open to it, because I don't think it offers any kind of threat to the Christian faith. And then he challenged Ayala to present evidence for macroevolution. And in my estimation, Ayala just utterly failed.
Oh, it was pretty bad. It was real bad.
And I heard a lot of atheist commentary say, well, Ayala's not a debater and all these things. Okay, yeah, I grant that. Craig is an excellent debater, maybe the best debater on the planet. He's definitely up there with them, right? Okay, of the ones we know of. Okay, fair enough. But at the same time, if you're an award-winning evolutionary scientist here, and you're just asked the question, can you give me some evidence for macroevolution? You don't need to be an excellent debater to do that.
If I remember right, he was given like examples of like dog breeding and stuff.
Exactly.
And it's
micro.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it reminded me of that review that you wrote years and years ago of
the greatest show on earth.
The greatest show on earth. And you basically said like, yeah, this is a beautifully written book. And Dawkins presents a lot of great examples of microevolution, but he just didn't convince me. I should be letting you give this summary, not me, but he didn't convince me that macroevolution has happened, So those are some of the reasons why I enjoyed that debate. All right, 2 more. So my next debate is a guy we've had on the podcast now 3 times, and it is between Chris Date and Dale Tuggy. Is Jesus human and not divine? Now, I love this debate because Dale Tuggy is, James White recently referred to him as the king of Unitarianism. I don't know if Tuggy would wear that crown or not, but he is certainly the most able defender that I know of Unitarianism, and the most able critic of the deity of Christ and the Trinity. And so this was between Tuggy and, of course, Chris Date. And Chris Date was arguing that Jesus was, obviously, he was arguing that Jesus was both human and divine. Now, what I love about this debate is the arguments are high level. Both men are at their absolute best. The conversations are rich and they are respectful. The clash and the cross-examination is absolutely great. And it is just a real delight to watch. I do think Date won. And one of the interesting bits in the debate that if you go back and watch it, there's a part where Chris brings an argument from ancient bird imagery to the deity of Christ. And he points out that anytime in antiquity, when this ancient bird imagery is used, it is always referring to deity. And of course, Jesus invokes this bird imagery for himself, thus indicating that he is deity. And Tuggy had never heard this argument. And so there's this point in the debate where you can tell Tuggy is just kind of taken aback by it and a little bit on his heels. And so anyway, that definitely is one of the most high quality debates I've ever seen. And they also did a book, which goes further into the debate for those of you that want to look into that.
Yeah, I remember when you mentioned that one, how much you liked that one. I went and listened to it and also found it very interesting.
Yes. Finally, my last one. And of course, it seems appropriate to end with Dr. William Lane Craig, who I think, if I were making some kind of Mount Rushmore of atheism, if you will, this gentleman that William Lane Craig debated would be on it. And his name is the one, the only, Paul Draper. Paul Draper is formidable. And in this debate, you can see why. It is really interesting to see Craig debate somebody who has such a similar debating style as his own, which is often not the case. Draper brings out some arguments in this debate that Craig is not super familiar with. In other words, they're not in Craig's field. And so this debate features William Lane Craig a little bit on his heels and having to think on his feet. And so that's definitely a change of pace, because I think Craig is usually the aggressor in a debate. And so this is just two men who I think represent the best of the best from both sides going at it. The discussion is rich, respectful. And again, it is interesting to see Craig have to respond to some arguments that he typically doesn't have to.
You never studied.
All right, so that's all your debates. Now, Chad, being the debate aficionado, are there any weird and wild debate moments you'd like to share?
Oh, man. Okay, so I thought about this too. I thought this is just kind of a fun add-on. What is the worst debate I've ever seen? What debate is just so cringeworthy that you can't help but to watch it more than once, right? There was a debate that took place 4 years ago between Jeff Durbin and Dr. James White. Now, I am not picking this debate because of them. They're both presuppositionalists. I'm not. They present, I think, what is a very good presuppositionalist case as much as they can. Then the two atheists were Dr. Clark and Dan Ellis. This, Brian, was the most bizarre thing that I had ever witnessed in a debate. Dr. Clark was tossing books in the trash during the debate. He was up walking around. He would demand that White and Durbin show him a miracle in the moment. At one point, he even challenged the audience of Christians to come up and, I believe, drink antifreeze, and said that if they really believed in God, that he would protect them from the poison. It was something that was poison. It may not have been antifreeze. And it was the most embarrassing thing I had ever seen. Have you ever watched something and you're embarrassed for the person?
Right, yeah.
That's what this was like. And at one point during the cross-examination, he's firing a question at Dr. White. Now, Dr. White just has no problem giving it back. And at one point, Dr. White asked him, "Do you want me to answer the question?" And the guy was like, "Show it to me, show it to me, show it to me," like that. And Dr. White said, "Sit down, sir. I am going to answer the question." But it was by far the strangest, most bizarre debate I have ever seen. And I felt bad for Dan Ellis, who was Dr. Clark's partner, because although I didn't think his argument-wise he brought much to the table, he was at least trying to have a reasonable discussion. Durbin and Dr. White were trying their best to remain professional, which they did. But it was a circus of a debate because of Dr. Clark. So that's definitely the worst I've seen. Well,
there you have it. Some of the debates we recommend. Now, these will be in the show notes, so you don't have to Google your Googles. You don't have to Google
your Googles. You don't have to Google your Googles, kids.
Anyway. All these debates will be included in the show notes, so you can check them out for yourself and report back. If you watch a debate and you said, "Hey, I like that one," send us a message, podcast@apologetics315.com. And if there's one or two you think Chad missed and he should have put on his list, then call him out. All right, we're going to see you in the next episode. So thank you for listening.
Yes, thank you, Jason, for writing in.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast, and we also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice, and please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Oughton and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.